Welcome back. Now, the #1 story of the week. White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki says the Space Force has the, quote, full support of the Biden administration. Defense News reports General Jay Raymond, the chief of space operations, says he welcomes the opportunity to talk to the Biden administration about the 6th branch of the military and its accomplishments so far. Kaitlyn Johnson's deputy director of the Aerospace Security Project, the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Eric Gomez is director of defense policy studies at the Cato Institute. Welcome to both of you. Thanks for coming on. Kaitlyn, do you think this announcement this week, this chain of events, was a big deal, or was this kind of what people expected in the military community, the national defense community, regarding the future of the Space Force?
Sure. Thanks, Francis, for having me. It's nice to be on with you and Eric. This was not surprising from the space policy community. You can see online, and many scholars have said that it's kind of inevitable that the Biden administration would support the Space Force. However, I think the chain of events in which the announcement was made was a little surprising and kind of amusing to some of us following these issues.
Eric, your view on this, was it just that the rollout was, the kind of the response, the reaction was a little clunky, or was there something else more to this, do you think?
I don't necessarily think there was something too much more here. And I wasn't surprised really that the administration came out with some support. I know that Space Force being such an important initiative of Donald Trump and that administration, some people worried that that might create too much of a linkage between Trump and the service. But support on the Hill is really strong. And even if Biden isn't a fan of the Space Force, and even if his administration reflects that in some of their budget, it's going to have to get through the Congress. And that's where I think we're going to see a lot of support for keeping the service around and helping it grow. So
that's where I wanted to go next, Eric. Where do you think we should look for markers in the budgets that are coming out from the White House and the way Congress starts to mark up both in appropriations and authorizations in 2021?
Well, I think one of the first things that Space Force is going to have to do is establish a sense of identity for itself as a service. I was very skeptical of creating a new service, just to put it out there. I didn't think that this was the right way to go for enhancing U.S. interest in space. But we did it, and now we're here with it. And I think that's going to manifest itself in some interesting ways in the budget cycle in terms of battles over resources, what sorts of activities the military does in space get put on the Space Force and how soon. So that's one thing I would look for in the budget cycle, is seeing how much of a budget increase does the Space Force get from its first year to its second, and what kind of things is it being asked to do or being expected to do by the Congress.
Kaitlyn, you've spoken on this program before about what the Space Force has accomplished in its first year and a kind of a preview to the second year. What building blocks do you see the force laying in the next year to get us to where we should be thinking about the Space Force 5 years from now, or 10 years from now, or 25 years from now?
Sure, Francis. I think you hit on a really critical point. And in my perspective, the U.S. military has had a issue recently, or in the past 2 decades, of focusing on the fight of today, the fight of tomorrow, and largely ignoring the fight of 20, 30 years from now. And so I think the Space Force has a great opportunity to refocus itself, to remodel what it has been doing when the same kind of organizations were under the Air Force, to think about what their mission is and what this kind of infinite mindset of what is the force of the future and how can they play that role. And so I'd look to see them establishing different methods to getting there. I think looking at what they're investing in, what their research and acquisition dollars are going towards, as well as who they're investing in. Right now, they're pulling in people from the Air Force, and they're starting to pull in people from the Navy and Marines as well, and Army. And so looking at the cadre that is incoming, I think will be a good determination of this as well.
Eric, I want to go back to your comment a moment ago about not being in favor of the establishment of the Space Force. Now that we have it, what is the most important thing that you think the Space Force should do, or that the DoD should do in general, to ensure the success of the Space Force, despite the reasons, whatever they were, that you weren't in favor of it in the first place? How to overcome the objections that you had?
Well, so Dr. Robert Farley of the University of Kentucky wrote a policy analysis for the Cato Institute about Space Force recently, and I think in that piece he lays out some of the bureaucratic and organizational challenges of having a new service. And I think if the Space Force wants to succeed, then addressing some of those concerns is going to be important. And some of that will just come with time, but it needs to have things of like, how do we measure the success of the Space Force? What kind of metrics do we use to tell if it's doing a good job or not? I don't think that's really decided yet. What role does the Space Force play in U.S. strategy more broadly? Is it primarily a support service, or is it doing something else? And these are all things that in the policy paper that Rob Farley wrote for Cato, he compared it to the Air Force. And when the Air Force came along, it had, one, it was very large. Two, it had a lot of that sort of history of World War II and World War I to build off of. Space Force doesn't really have that as much. So it's going to be a difficult challenge. And that's where we're going to see, I think, a lot of these power plays or organizational politics come into play between the Space Force and other branches as they try to figure out who is doing what in space for the U.S. military. So I'm going to watch that very closely to see how does it shake out and where does the Space Force land in terms of these questions of organizational politics and bureaucratic experience.
Eric and Kaitlyn, thanks both very much for joining me today. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Francis.